Hey folks, Seth here. As we watch cities burn, statues being torn down, and calls to defund the police, if you haven't already, it may be time to think about personal protection. Guns Etc. has 10,200 square feet of guns, ammo, safes, and a staff that will work with you to find the best firearm for your situation. So stop by their huge store in Mesa or click on gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $400 million in firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy July 15th. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave a sermon several times called A Knock at Midnight. You've heard me play it here on the show a few times. One of the key paragraphs is when he says, quote, "It is midnight within the moral order. At midnight, colors lose their distinctiveness and become a sullen shade of gray. Moral principles lose their distinctiveness. For modern man, absolute right and absolute wrong are a matter of what the majority is doing. Right and wrong are relatives to likes and dislikes and the customs of a particular community. We have unconsciously applied Einstein's theory of relativity, which properly described the physical universe, to the moral and ethical realm." Close quote. Martin Luther King was no believer in the Oprahized world of my truth, your truth, his truth. What we spoke about here on Monday is what King spoke about, the truth. And he loved speaking of the self-evident truths found in our Declaration of Independence. And what he said about colors at midnight losing their distinctiveness, he could have also said about language losing its meaning. This is a big concern of mine, has been forever. Lewis Carroll, in a very Platonic moment, invoking the argument of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, gave us this dialogue between Humpty Dumpty and Alice. "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I mean, there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humphrey Dumpty, "which is to be master. That is all." Which gets me to a whole host of problems we face today. You see, I agree with Confucius, who put it, "When words lose their meaning, people lose their liberty." Or Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his book on nature, he put it thus, quote, "A man's power to connect his thought with its proper symbol, and so to utter it, depends on the simplicity of his character, that is, upon his love of truth, and his desire to communicate it without loss. The corruption of man is followed by the corruption of language. The corruption of language leads to the corruption of man. And note his predicate, the use of language depends upon the user's love of truth. Not arbitrary truth, truth. For arbitrary truth will lead to the arbitrary use of language, right? That's what Emerson is saying here. So I grew up and was trained to believe that not only does truth matter, but language matters. It's not just a Western concept or a white concept. It's Asian. I gave you Confucius. It's transcendent. Even Don Miguel Ruiz, in his beautiful book, The Four Agreements, based on pre-Columbian indigenous thought, has as his first agreement, be impeccable with your words, meaning have and use integrity when you speak. And so knowing all this, as innately I think we all really do, I could learn things, as we all could, through what we spoke of as the miracle of language, the miracle of the common noun, and all the rest. It's what gives power to reason. The integrity of language allows people to reason. What separates us, as Aristotle instructs, is this very language. It separates us from other animals. So I knew how special and uniquely beautiful freedom was, and maybe you have to be taught about that, so you don't take it for granted. Ronald Reagan thought so, right? He said freedom isn't just something that passes through the bloodstream, it has to be taught as much as it has to be fought for. And in knowing what freedom was and loving it, I of course learned what tyranny was. as one can only understand beauty by knowing what is ugly. One can only understand any value-laden race, in Latin thing, by knowing its opposite. Otherwise, it has no value, no real meaning. If there are no poor people, there are no rich people. If there is no such thing as cold, we can't understand what warm means. If we are never sick, we don't know what it means to be well. Heaven means nothing if there is no hell. Pain-free and pain and the like. So we grew up learning these things, and we learned there were good people and bad, bullies and helpers, friends and enemies. We learned to stay away from the bullies, to nurture those who were saints, to be and become and welcome friends. And we know and learn, too, that good and bad, evil and decent inclinations could run through any of us, individually as well as societally. How did Abraham Lincoln put it? He said, "Our founders knew the proneness of prosperity to breed tyrants, and they meant when such should reappear in this fair land and commence their vocation, they should find left for them at least one hard nut to crack, the Declaration's words that all men are created equal." He called it a maxim, a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors, everywhere. Close quote. I learned as a young child, as I think all young Jewish children learn, and as all American children used to learn, what Nazism was. We learned what terrorism was. We learned what hate and prejudice were. And we learned, too, in turn, to take great offense, nay, to actually hate prejudice and bigotry in all its forms. In fact, this was something almost all Jews were taught early on, even before the 1930s, which is why they were so instrumental in helping found the NAACP, why there were things known as the Rosenwald schools, over 5,000 of them built by Julius Rosenwald for the education of black children. It's why Rabbi Joshua Heschel was so instrumental in helping Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. We were all very well sensitized to the real meaning of racism, bigotry, prejudice, and the like. And whether we knew it or not, we inherently knew the meaning of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Which is why the corruption of those words today bothers me so much, and why I fear this linguistic and moral corruption that has turned those especially inimical traits and concepts like racism and bigotry into a sullen shade, to use Martin Luther King's words, a sullen shade where everything loses its significance and meaning. It shouldn't bother me so much personally because I was raised Jewish. It should bother me, and does, so much personally because I was raised American. And we know, or used to know, what happens when you decategorize some people out of the category of human and treat them like animals. But corruption of our language about all this came politically. It started when relativists, the kind of philosophy King denounced, it started when they started to use these helpful but once truly odious terms for political purposes, for crass and crude political purposes. In the 1960s, for example, it wasn't enough to condemn or criticize Barry Goldwater on the merits for wanting to reduce the welfare state and expand the fight against global Marxism. He had to be relegated to an Untermensch. This was done by calling him crazy, or worse, a racist and a bigot. Quick example, San Francisco Mayor John Shelley said Republicans, quote, had Mein Kampf as their political Bible when they held their 1964 convention there. Columnist Drew Pearson, for example, wrote that the smell of fascism has been in the air at the 1964 convention. The Chicago Defender ran the headline, GOP Convention 1964 recalls Germany 1933. Immediately, one would have hoped shame would come to those who said those things about the man who helped found the NAACP in Arizona and led the fight to desegregate Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. But no, racism was too tempting and too pregnant a calumny not to use, if it could be used. But it was and is now political pyrite. For to use such language against such a man, and as such language is used now, had an effect, downgrading the toxicity and noxiousness of Mein Kampf, National Socialism, racism, bigotry, prejudice, and the like. For if Goldwater was Hitler, how bad could Hitler have possibly been. This went on and on against Republicans. Anyone remember how much of a racist George W. Bush was? Indeed, it hasn't died. Just last month, a popular left-wing website had an article titled, quote, "The racist war criminal George W. Bush's words on George Floyd are salt in the wound," close quote. You'll recall the campaign ad against George W. Bush in 2002, where he was held morally and politically liable for the horrific, dragging death of a black man. The last line of that ad from the victim's daughter about George Bush's policies, quote, "It was like my father was killed all over again," close quote. And of course, you know the record on Trump. Louder, perhaps, more widespread because of the internet, perhaps, but the same exact dilution of the words racism and Nazi applied to him as to every Republican since Goldwater, such that the word has lost all its meaning, which is too bad, a moral sin, really, because, as I like to remind in the story of the boy who cried wolf, there really was a wolf at the end. There really are racists and bigots and National Socialists. But now everything has been taken up one major step, one giant, or one might say one great leap forward. Have you seen the latest campaign from the National Museum of African American History? It's part of the Smithsonian. Oh, its charter was signed into law, and adding it to the Smithsonian by, wait for it, the racist President George W. Bush. The latest campaign, your tax dollars at work, hundreds of millions of them, it's called Whiteness. First line, quote, "Since white people in America hold most of the political, institutional, and economic power, they receive advantages that non-white groups do not," close quote. I'd like to just keep quoting the document. It is perhaps the most actually prejudiced and bigoted public document I've seen in recent memory, if the words prejudice and bigoted still have any meaning. Quote, "Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal." Continuing, "This white dominant culture also operates as a social mechanism that grants advantages to white people, since they can navigate society both by feeling normal and being viewed as normal. Persons who identify as white rarely have to think about their racial identity because they live within a culture where whiteness has been normalized. Thinking about race is very different for non-white persons living in America. People of color must always consider their racial identity, whatever the situation, due to the systematic and interpersonal racism that still exists," close quote. There's more, much more, including a video on white supremacy by a Marxist academic, and a chart that shows you how to know whiteness. It includes beliefs in self-reliance, literally, not making this up. It includes the belief in rugged individualism. It includes belief in the nuclear family, helpfully explaining that 2.3 children is an example, just in case you need a for instance, let's say. Not making this up. Emphasis on the scientific method is a sign of whiteness, they tell us. Again, not making it up. You almost think we're entering Jeff Foxworthy territory here. You might just know you're white if you believe in hard work as the key to success, and that work must come before play. Those things are on the chart. Honestly, truly, work before play. It's on the chart. How about this, where Christianity is the norm? Somebody better tell the King family, maybe even Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton too, all Christian reverends, they might just be white, or at least suffering from, as the Smithsonian puts it, whiteness. I understood this temptation to political junk thought long ago. As Harry Jaffa put it, what could possibly be white mathematics or white economics or white biology or white physics or, for that matter, white political science? Was there anything in Plato's Republic that indicated it was white justice that Socrates was seeking to define or discover? Was there anything in the Nicomachean Ethics to indicate that it was white happiness that Aristotle sought as the summum bonum? Was there anything in Locke's second treatise of government or in the Declaration of Independence to indicate that taxation without representation was unjust only for whites? Was there anything in Locke's letters on toleration or in the Virginia statute for religious freedom to indicate that it was only the case of white human beings that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, any more than our opinions on physics or geometry? Shame on them. But perhaps you see my problem. There are no more pejoratives left to describe what's going on here because they've all been taken, used, vitiated, and made commonplace, robbed of their meaning. But there were words for this kind of raw, idiotic, literally idiotic, profane fanaticism once. But it's midnight in the social order now, and all meanings have lost their definition. This is not just a rhetorical or linguistic worry. The implications are broad and they are wide, for they go to the heart and soul of, well, what it used to mean to have a heart and soul, the condition of being human, and all that wonderful condition used to entail. We thought we won the war against National Socialism and Marxism, didn't we? We didn't. It's entrenched here now, and sadly, at the Smithsonian. The corruption of man follows the corruption of language indeed. Just remember, the derivation of the word corruption, it comes from the Latin word for destroy. I'm Seth Leibson. The lines are open and we'll be right back.